Okay, continuing in our series entitled The Power of the Eucharist, we come to the section on the real, true, and substantial presence of Jesus in the Holy Eucharist. Now, backtrack a little bit. You understand that the Church teaches that the Eucharist is the source, the center, and the summit of the Church's life. Okay? I'll say that again. It's very important. The Eucharist is the source. In other words, that's where we derive all of our life from in the Church. The source, the center. In other words, the life of the Church is centered on the Holy Eucharist. If the celebration of the Holy Eucharist and the real presence of the Holy Eucharist isn't the center of your life, then there's something wrong. We need to focus, especially this year now. This is the year of the Holy Eucharist. This year we should make a commitment, do something special, to draw closer to Jesus in the Eucharist. One of the ways you can do this is by studying this part of the faith, the teaching on the Eucharist. You know, we should learn as best we can. It's not rocket science, believe me. You can get this. You can understand the teaching every bit as well as I can. You take the Catechism of the Catholic Church, you know, some of the tapes, whatever, the Holy Father's Apostolic Letter. You read, you study, you pray, and you advance in your spiritual life. Believe me, please believe me. When you do this, you're filled with life, and then you radiate life. It's something that just happens. You don't have to be conscious of it. It's like another way that we can do this is through adoration. I'll talk more about that later, tomorrow. But adoration of the Blessed Sacrament. My goodness, Jesus is here. It isn't just a sign of Jesus. It is Jesus. Really, truly, and substantially present in the Holy Eucharist. Now, if he's here in the Tabernacle, and he is, then where else could we want to be? But, as we know, most of the Church is scattered here, there, and everywhere else. And we don't have any time. You do, you're here. But when I'm talking generally, 80% of Catholics in North America don't go to Mass on Sunday. Now, I know you do. God bless you. But I'm talking in general here. Now, you may say, well, why does that concern me? Listen. I've been accused of preaching to the choir before. People have said to me, don't you know you're preaching to the choir? You know, you're talking to the good folks. And at first I thought about that. I said, gee, am I wasting my life? You know, these are the good people. You know, these are the people, they don't need to hear this. They already know it. No, wrong. Wrong. Even Jesus talked to the good folks. What he did was he confirmed them in their faith. What does the Pope do? He confirms the brethren. What do the brethren do? They go out to the rest of the world. So my job is to form you. Your job is to go out into the workplace, your family, the rest of the country, the world, and form the rest of them. Okay? So, we give you what you need, we equip you, and then you go out and live your Catholic Christian life. You have to have power to accomplish this mission. And the power comes from the Eucharist. Let me read to you part of what I would consider the Magna Carta on the Holy Eucharist. The 6th chapter of the Gospel of John. I would consider that the Magna Carta. It's just really the major teaching from the Gospel on the Holy Eucharist. I'll start here with chapter 6. I'll begin here with verse 48. I am the bread of life, Jesus says. I am the bread of life. Your ancestors ate manna in the desert, but they died. This is the bread that comes down from heaven, for a man to eat and never die. I myself am the living bread come down from heaven. If anyone eats this bread, he shall live forever. The bread I will give is my flesh for the life of the world. At this, the Jews quarreled among themselves, saying, how can he give us his flesh to eat? Thereupon Jesus said to them, let me solemnly assure you, if you do not eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. If you do not eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no life in you. Now that's the Lord speaking, eternal truth. Their problem was, of course, lack of faith. He gave the teaching on the Eucharist, the basic teaching. Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you can't live. And he's talking about eternal life. He's talking about the power of sanctifying grace. In the early years of my preaching, in traveling around the country and the world, I would give parish missions, and as an exercise, it was rhetorical in nature, you could say. I would give an exam at the end of the day on Saturday, and simple, not complicated, 10 questions, to show the people that they really didn't know their faith. The average grade was about 42%. And the questions were simple, that I would ask children. What are the 10 commandments? You know, you get, in a 10-question exam, I'll give you 10% credit for getting that wrong. If you get one of them wrong, you don't get any credit. You got to know the 10 commandments. Now, that's the first question. You know, think about it for a minute. How are you going to make an examination of conscience to go to confession before you go to the Eucharist if you don't even know the 10 commandments? And I'll guarantee you I can take a microphone and come down right now. You don't think so. I'll do it. You know I will. I'll come right down there and I'll look for a guilty face and I'll find one fast. And I'll say, what are the 10 commandments? And somebody will say, well, do I have to get them in order? Yeah. Right? That's basic stuff. That's basic stuff. The 10 Commandments, we're required to obey them always and everywhere, and no one has the power to dispense from them. No one. And Vatican II didn't change them to the 10 suggestions. They're the 10 Commandments. And they'll always be the 10 Commandments. And you have to know what they mean. Okay? Basic stuff. In this teaching on the Eucharist, basic. It's very, very basic. Let me tell you something. Don't flatter yourself by thinking you're getting an advanced course in theology with me. I am a kindergarten teacher. Always have been. Always will be. When I finished my doctorate, the professor, who was the president of the panel that examined me, said, well, you've now received all the degrees you can get in the church. I had earned 5 university degrees, and I earned them with highest honors by the grace of God. And he said, so at what level will you teach? Well, that was a rhetorical question. You know, he thought I was going to say in the seminary, you know, I'll be teaching in seminary, or I'll be teaching in a Catholic university, graduate students. That's where someone with my credentials would normally teach. But I didn't have to, I didn't bat an eye. I said kindergarten. He looked at me. That's right, kindergarten. I'll be teaching kindergarten, because 99% of Catholics are in kindergarten and never get out of kindergarten. So that's where I teach. I teach kindergarten. Now look, you're good-natured people, and that's why I get away with it with you. I wouldn't get away with a lot of places, but I know who you are. You're good-natured folks, and you have some humility, and you can take it right between the eyes, and that's where I give it to you, right between the eyes. Now, I'll guarantee you, if you think I'm wrong, I can prove you wrong. If you think most people know their faith, it'll take me about 10 minutes to demolish that sophistry. Most people don't know their faith, and most of you don't either, and you're the good people. What is sanctifying grace? Now, you know, a lot of times we assume we know things, like we assume we know our faith. It's like my chemistry professor in high school, Mr. Stiles. The first day of class, we walked in, he had a limp, he had a bad leg, and he limped up to the blackboard, and he wrote the word assume on the blackboard. And he glared out at us and he said, never assume. Because if you do, you will make a ASS slash out of you and me. Never assume. He's right. Never assume. You have to, if you have assumptions, you have to bear them out. What is sanctifying grace? 99% of you don't have an answer. When there's a question, you gotta have an answer. That's basic stuff, by the way. You know, it doesn't have to be fancy, big words, nothing. You could say, sanctifying grace is a share in divine life. That's a simple answer. Good enough. Yeah. It's a way that we share in divine life. Where does sanctifying grace come from? Sanctifying grace comes from the 7 sacraments. You know, sanctifying grace, as opposed to actual graces, or the graces we receive from prayer, penance, good works. Sanctifying grace, share in divine life, comes from the sacraments, okay? The Eucharist. In the order of time, the Eucharist isn't the first sacrament. Baptism is, right? You have to be baptized first before you can receive the other sacraments. Baptism capacitates you for the reception of the other sacraments. But in the order of grace, in a sense, the Eucharist is first. Why? Because the essence of the Eucharist is the passion, death, and resurrection of Christ, the Paschal mystery. That's the essence of the Eucharist. Passion, death, and resurrection of the Lord. That is where all sanctifying grace comes from. That's like the well springs of grace. And that channels grace into all the other sacraments. Paschal mystery. Basic refresher. I know you know this, but once again, confirming you in your faith. Now, the reason many of you would fail the test isn't because you never heard it before. It's just that you're not immediately conversant with the answer. You haven't quite formulated it in your... You can get it, it's easy. You can all get 100 on the test. You're all A students in potential, no question about that. And it's not hard. Remember who Jesus chose to be the first apostles. They weren't men with doctorate degrees from universities, right? They were old fishermen, simple guys. You can get it. Very easy. The Eucharist. Holy Thursday. Now we're in Lent, moving towards Holy Week, right? That's the culmination, the apex, focal point of our faith is in Holy Week. Why? Well, the Easter Triduum. Holy Thursday, Good Friday, and then moving into the resurrection of Sunday. The Passion, the death, and the resurrection of Christ. Why did the eternal Word become flesh and dwell among us? Redemption, salvation, right? He assumed a human nature, became like one of us in everything except sin. So Jesus, the eternal Word, a divine person, assumed a human nature and became like one of us in everything except sin. He suffered. He took that human nature to a cross. He suffered, he died, and he rose on the third day. Now, Holy Thursday, Jesus, this divine person acting through his human nature, that's called a theandric action. Theandric action. You don't necessarily have to remember that. That's a Greek word. It's two Greek words, really. Theandric action means an action of the God-man. It's the two words for God and man, okay? Jesus, a divine person, acting through his human nature. What does he do? He takes bread, says the blessing. It's the first Mass, right? Holy Thursday. What does Jesus institutes two sacraments Holy Thursday night, right? Priesthood, Eucharist. Those are the two sacraments that are inextricably intertwined. They're all related. But remember this. My girls that work for me in my office, they have a plaque on the wall. And it's very relevant to these times. And on that plaque it says, no priest, no Eucharist. Remember that. No priest, no Eucharist. No priest, no source of the church's life. No priest, no center of the church's life. No priest, no summit of the church's life. Why? No priest, no Eucharist. And the Eucharist is the source, center, and summit of the church's life. Hence the attack on the priesthood. Why? I have a rather well-traveled sermon called Endgame. It's the name of a series I did. And the title talk of that series is called Endgame. And that's a term from chess. The devil's endgame. That's get rid of the priest in order to get rid of the Eucharist. Because if you can get rid of the Eucharist, you get rid of all the power. That's the source of power for good. Strike down the priest, discredit him. And that'll be my last talk tomorrow, by the way, on the priesthood and the Eucharist. This is very, very important for you good lay people to know. The morale, the discipline in the priesthood is the worst that I have ever seen. It's the worst that it's been in centuries, as far as I can tell. Get rid of the priest, you get rid of the Eucharist. Now, what happened that Holy Thursday night? Remember, Jesus is a divine person. He's a divine person acting through a human nature. As a divine person, he's eternal, right? That's basic. God is eternal. God is not constrained by time and space. God transcends time and space. And so Holy Thursday, this divine person acting through his human nature takes bread and wine, and you have the first, the Last Supper, the first Mass. Poised, as it were, above time and space, this divine person, the Heavenly Father's only Son, reaches forward in time to the next day, right? The passion, death, and and resurrection we're talking about here. So Holy Thursday, Jesus reaches forward in time to the next day, his sacrifice, right? Good Friday. And he makes that present. He's eternal. And so Thursday night, you celebrate what happened the next day. How can he do that? He's eternal. He's an eternal person, he's a divine person, hence he's eternal because of that. 2,000 years later, that same Jesus, that same divine person, that same high priest, working through his ministerial priest, we are merely instruments. I can't effect the miracle that takes place at Mass, where plain bread and wine is changed in substance into the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ. Only God can do that. Only God can perform miracles. I cannot forgive a sin. Only God can forgive a sin, but he does it through me and any other priest. Jesus, the high priest, see, this is the principle of instrumentality that I'm giving you here, okay? You have a tool, a musical instrument, violin, piano, and a master takes the instrument and plays a symphony. The principle of instrumentality. Jesus is the high priest. I could ask you a trick question on the exam. I wouldn't do that. But I could ask you a trick question like I do this to seminarians sometimes. How many priests are there, I'll say. Now, seminarians study a lot, you know, and they're always reading and they know a bunch of facts. And so someone will say, there are 489,712 priests. Because they read it in the Catholic directory. That's how many priests there are in the world. And I'll say, nope. Oh yeah, that's what it is. Nope. One. There is only one priest, absolutely speaking, and that's Jesus Christ, the high priest. However, he has multiple subjects of action, ministerial priest, that he works through. So at Mass, Jesus, the high priest, working through the instrumentality of his ministerial priest, takes bread, the host. And Jesus speaks these words in the power of the Holy Spirit through the instrumentality of his ministerial priest. Take this, all of you, and eat it. This is my body, which will be given up for you. And then taking the cup filled with wine, take this, all of you, and drink from it. This is the cup of my blood. Who's talking? Jesus is talking. How's he talking? He's talking through the lips of his priest. But he's the one who's doing the talking. And his words have power. And what happens? That bread and that wine is changed in substance into the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ. Any fragment of the consecrated host, any single drop of the precious blood, and by the way, don't call it wine after the consecration. I've been all over the world, and Eucharistic ministers here, there, and they don't do it here because they're better trained here. But at many places, they'll do it, and they'll say, you know, well, you know, you take the wine, and I want to grab them and shake them. It's not wine after the consecration. It's not. That's heresy. It's the precious blood of Jesus. It's not bread after the consecration. What happens? It's changed in substance. Now, I'm giving you a doctrinal teaching here on the real presence, okay? It's the topic of this talk. Why did I choose that as a topic? Because it's been under attack. And I'm not talking about from the Protestants. Oh, I love our Protestant brothers and sisters, and I almost never have any problem with them. Who am I talking about? I'm talking about the Catholics who don't believe, the priests, the theologians who don't believe what the church believes. I was thrown out of a certain religious order because of a fight over the real present. They didn't believe, some of them, that it was really, truly, and substantially Jesus after the consecration. One of them said, well, after Mass, it's no longer Jesus. During Mass, they were giving me a certain brand of Lutheran theology, and nothing against the Lutheran. But when you're dealing with Catholic theology, deal with Catholic theology. They say, oh, it's not Jesus after Mass. You see, they weren't purifying the sacred vessels, and they were putting them away in the closet in the sacristy with consecrated particles on the paten, some of the precious blood left in the chalice. Bothered me. And they'd say, you're scrupulous. I say, you're nuts. It's either Jesus or it isn't. And, and there was a running battle for a while. Finally I went in. I used to go in, I'd sneak into the sacristy, and I'd check the sacred vessels, and I'd purify them if they weren't purified. One day I went in there, and it struck me so hard. Listen, this is Jesus. After the consecration, if it's sense perceptible, in other words, you can still see the crumbs of the bread, You can still see the drops of precious blood, even if it's just a couple drops. It doesn't matter. It's still the Lord. So I took all the benediction candles, put them on the credence table and lit them. Not the credence table, on the vesting table, and I lit them. And I knelt down and made a holy hour in the sacristy. And the provincial came in. And he said, what are you doing? I said, well, you all put Jesus in the closet. I thought I'd better make a holy hour. Somebody ought to. I wasn't long for that place. I was evicted within a couple days. I was given an hour to get out of town. Our faith tells us. And don't you dare. I'll talk to you like my old man used to talk to me when he got real serious about something. He said, don't you dare do this, that, or the other. Don't you dare let anybody steal the essentials of your faith from you. I don't care what upstart theologian educated into imbecility says different. Our faith says after the consecration, it isn't bread and wine. It's the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ. And falling down, we worship him. And don't you dare ever let anybody take that away from you. That's what it is. That's what it is. And it's the same yesterday, today, and forever. The essentials of our faith are unchanging. The truth cannot change. Why? The truth is immutable by definition. Why? Well, all truth that truly is subsists in him who is the truth. Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Jesus is God, a divine person. God doesn't change. Why not? Because he's perfect. That which is perfect admits of no change. God isn't on the way. He is eternally arrived. And so the truth, in its essence, can't change, and it won't change. And what we're talking about here is essential matters of faith and morals. I'm not talking about discipline, okay? Whether or not we can eat meat on Friday, that's discipline. That can change. Whether or not we celebrate Mass in Latin or the vernacular, that can change. That's not doctrine. That's discipline. Many things can change. Sometimes they should change. But some things cannot change. You know, there's so many examples. It's like the thing with women's ordination. The Holy Father said, as a last word, we don't have the power to change the teaching of Jesus Christ. And that's all there is to it. No pope that ever comes along later will ever change it, because he doesn't have the power to change it. Essential matters of teaching in faith and morals cannot change. We may want them to change, but they cannot change. And no amount of wishing for it will ever change it, and a democratic vote will never change it, you know. Jesus Christ never intended that eternal truth be determined by a democratic vote. The truth is what it is, yesterday, today, and forever. Therefore, do not be carried away by all kinds of strange teaching. I just quoted to you from the letter to the Hebrews. That's what it says there. So, after the consecration, what happens? We have Jesus himself. Body, blood, soul, and divinity. Let me read to you from the Catechism. I'm getting old, you know. I have to wear glasses when I read now, most of the time. Christ Jesus, who died, yes, who was raised from the dead, and who is at the right hand of God, who intercedes for us, is present in many ways to his church, right? God is present in many different ways. Now, let me give you a clue on this teaching. What we're talking about here when we talk about the real presence, we're talking about modes of presence. Don't let the word mode, that's a philosophical term, don't let mode throw you. Don't be intimidated by a four-letter word. It's a very small word, so don't be intimidated by such a small thing. It means way. A mode of presence is a way of being present, okay? So there are many ways God can be present to us, right? God is present to us in nature, right? He's omnipresent. God is present in the ministers of the sacraments. God is present in all the baptized. Really, God is really present in those ways. Now, the mode of Christ's presence under the Eucharist is unique. It raises the Eucharist above all the sacraments as the perfection of the spiritual life and the end to which all sacraments tend. In the most blessed sacrament of the Eucharist, the body and blood, together with the soul and divinity of our Lord Jesus Christ, and therefore the entire Christ, is truly, really, and substantially contained. Now, this presence is called real, which is not intended to exclude the other ways of being present, as if they are not real, but because it is presence in the fullest sense. That is to say, it is a substantial presence by which Christ, true God and true man, makes himself holy and entirely present. Okay, so when we say the real presence, that doesn't mean that God isn't really present in other ways. He is. But the most noble, the highest way that God is present to us in this life is in the Eucharist. Okay? That's the way of being present par excellence, the church says, using the French. Okay? That's the most noble, most beautiful, fullest way of being present. Now, when we say body, blood, soul, and divinity, we're talking about Jesus, true God, and Jesus, true man. Body, blood, and soul speaks of the humanity of Christ. Divinity, obviously, the Godhead, the divine nature of Jesus. All right. The last many popes have made a radical statement. They've said that the gap between what we believe and what we live is way too big, right? There is a tremendous gap, a large expanse of distance between what we profess and what we live. Now, the Eucharist is a perfect example of that. I'm trying to articulate for you the high points of the Church's teaching on the Holy Eucharist this weekend. We believe this. What I'm talking about here, that's doctrine. As a Catholic, you either believe that or you're a heretic, in plain English, okay? It's not optional teaching. You either believe it or you don't believe what the Church believes. So it's essential teaching. Now remember, I didn't say you have to understand it. It doesn't say in the Bible without understanding it is impossible to please God. It says without faith it is impossible to please God. So we walk by faith, not by sight. Yes, try to understand better. But first you give the assent of faith. People make a bad mistake trying to understand first. You know, they say, if I can understand it, then I'll believe it. No, that's not how it works. You believe it first, and then God will give you light to help you. But you will never understand it completely this side of heaven. In heaven, we'll understand a lot better. Why? Because heaven expands the intellect. Your intellect is elevated and given a new power in heaven. You can see God directly, face to face, as he is. Here, only in a mediated fashion can we see God, through sense-perceptible means, through analogies and so forth. Okay. The gap. Back to the gap between what we profess and what we live. I guess it can be summed up in an experience I had with a man who had been a Pentecostal pastor for 25 years. A very fine man. A man who clearly loved God. A wonderful man. From a family of pastors. His dad, his grandfather. And he said to me one day, I wish I could believe what you Catholics believe. And I said, Pastor, why's that? And he said, well, if I could believe what you Catholics believe about Jesus in the Eucharist, that he's really there, that he's truly and substantially there, why, you know, I'd come into the closest Catholic church I could find. I'd prostrate myself before the Tabernacle, and you couldn't pry me out of there with a crowbar. Because if Jesus is there, where else could I want to be? And I said, oh, Pastor, you're not far from the kingdom, buddy. That Christmas, he entered the Catholic Church, because God gave him the grace. I'll tell you how it started. It's interesting how these things often go. Remember how I told you the year before the Holy Father named that year the year of the Rosary? Year of the Rosary. Led up to the year of the Eucharist. Very often Mary opens the door for a closer relationship with Jesus. Now tomorrow morning, I will talk about the Blessed Mother, as I always do on Saturday. Always. Since the day I began. Don't want to leave her out. Years ago, I was teaching a preparation course for the de Montfort consecration. That's the consecration where you give everything to Jesus through Mary. And this Pentecostal pastor, he was coming to the lectures. That's how I met him. And at the end of it was a 33-day preparation. At the end of it, he said to me, you know, I'd like to make this consecration. He was searching. His wife had passed away, and he had had some traumatic experiences in addition to that, and he was struggling. He was in pain, and somehow he came to this Catholic parish where I was preaching for an extended period of time, and he talked to me. He's a very respectful man. I'll tell you how respectful he was. He'd come to Mass and sit in the front pew. And at Holy Communion time, he'd come up with his arms crossed, indicating he wanted a blessing. See, he understood he couldn't receive the Eucharist. But he was humble. He was humble enough to want a blessing from the priest. That's very unusual. I saw in that humility, I said, God must be going to do a great thing here with this man, because this is a very holy man here. Anyway, we got ready about to make the consecration March 25th, and he came to me the night before, late, and he said, I've been with you these 33 days, I'm making this, and I'd love to make that consecration tomorrow, but he said, well, could you go over that again? 33 days worth. I said, it was about 11 p.m. He went home, and he sat in his chair. He told me this the next day. See, next day, he came, he was right in the front pew. Mass for the, Feast of the Annunciation, March 25th. And he's there to make the consecration. I went, what on earth? He made it. And I said, what happened? He said, well, last night I went home, sat in my chair all alone at home, quiet. And I couldn't come to it. I studied theology, and I've been a pastor 25 years. He says, just not my tradition. I just couldn't come to it intellectually. And that's I can understand that. Many, many, many people who are brilliant could never come to the fullness of Christianity in Catholicism. They couldn't do it intellectually. Malcolm Muggeridge, who was a great journalist from Britain, and he tried and tried and tried and tried and couldn't do it. And then one day he met Mother Teresa, and boom. It wasn't an intellectual argument. It was laying eyes on her, and it changed everything. Well, old Don sat in the chair, and he was kind of agonizing over this, trying to come to it intellectually, and he couldn't do it. And he said, all of a sudden, I had the strangest experience. It's like on a cold day, you're standing there watching a parade, and you're with your mama and your little boy, and she wraps her coat around you to keep you warm. And I knew I had a mother, and I knew her name was Mary. And so he made that consecration. But he couldn't come to the Eucharist. He just couldn't get that. He was respectful, but he just couldn't come to it that it's the same sacrifice of Calvary, that it's really Jesus. A couple months later, I was in San Antonio, and I was at the home of some lay members of our religious society, and the mom of the woman was dying. She was elderly, had been sick a long time. And I was celebrating Mass in their home, in the room of this elderly lady. And Don showed up, this pastor. And he was from Texas originally, and he knew these people. So I said, well, we're about to have Mass. You want to stay for Mass? Sure. So we're just a few of us, There's like the lady in bed, she was dying, really. And her daughter, and the daughter's husband, and Don. And so I began Mass. When it came to the offertory, I never say this, I said, we're now about to enter in. We don't repeat the sacrifice. We don't. We enter into it and make it present. Jesus offered sacrifice once for all. A lot of the differences that we have with the Protestant churches are the result of lack of understanding more than disagreement. They don't really understand what we believe. And I don't blame them. That's our fault for not teaching that clearly. But I said that. I never say that at the offertorium. As I said, we don't repeat the sacrifice here. Jesus offered sacrifice once for all. But Jesus, through his ministerial priest, remember he's eternal, we enter into the one only sacrifice and make it present. We don't repeat it. That's a theological fact. And then I went on. At the consecration, after the consecration, I elevated the host, as the priest does. I say through him, with him, and in him. So I noticed out of the corner of my eye, old Brother Don, he was sobbing. He was shaking in his chair, sobbing. And when old Brother Don sobs and shakes, a whole lot of shaking going on because he weighed 350s. And so he's sobbing and shaking. And I went on and finished Mass. And I went home after. I said, Don, what happened? And he said, well, I was trying to pray, and you know, at the consecration, I had my eyes closed. I was praying, and there was Jesus. I saw Jesus. I said, you did? He said, yeah. And he smiled at me, and he said, Don, enter in. And right there, I knew you Catholics were right. I didn't have the slightest doubt. I said, well, what gave you the clue? At that point, you know, divine intervention hit him between the eyes. What are you going to say? Well, it happened. Everything changed. God must have loved that old boy an awful lot. He gave him some extraordinary manifestations of his love. And those things aren't normal, and we don't normally need those things, but sometimes we do, and they can save a whole lot of time. So old Don, he entered the Catholic Church on Christmas, made his first Holy Communion. Enter in. Enter in. Our faith is so beautiful. Our faith is so beautiful, so liberating, so empowering. How can you not enter in? You may have not known it before, at least maybe not heard it quite in those words, but now go forward totally confirmed that you're going to make progress this year of the Holy Eucharist. This is the year of the Holy Eucharist, remember. I keep repeating things. I read a study once that was done on education. And it said that, it's a psychological study, it said that you have to hear something 18 times before your brain finally keeps it as permanent. So I repeat stuff a lot. There have been people who have been listening to me for 15 years or so, and one elderly Baptist lady, by the way, is one of them, in Mississippi. You know, she makes me cookies and does Afghans and stuff and sends them to me. Baptist lady, and watches me on television. And she said, you know, I've been watching you for years, and one thing I noticed, you don't say too much new. And I said, honey, you're observant. You're right. And if I ever start saying something new, run. There ain't nothing new I can say. It's 2,000 years old, and that's pretty old. But it's ever ancient, ever new. That's our faith. And the Eucharist, this teaching on the Eucharist, is magnificent. It's beautiful. Just think about it for a minute. Just think about it. What happens at Mass? I mean, the miracle of Holy Mass. Jesus, the high priest, working through his ministerial priest. The words of consecration, plain bread and wine, is changed in substance. Now I'm talking about the doctrine of transubstantiation, right? That word simply means changed from one substance into another. They have not come up with a better word, and if they ever do, it has to mean the same thing. So some of the weak attempts that have taken place in recent years to change that don't fly. Bread and wine is changed in substance into Jesus himself. Anything less than that is insufficient. That's what we believe, see. And when we take the host, consecrate host, put in the tabernacle, you know, for the sick or for adoration, get this through your head. I know you know this, but I have to confirm you in your faith. I have to make you stronger in your faith so you can go out into the pagan world and give witness to this. Don't let anybody ever tell you that you're off your rocker because you believe this stuff. Oh, they will tell you that, some of them. But do not be swayed. This is absolute 100% truth. It's Jesus. What happens at Mass? It's the same sacrifice of Calvary. The one only sacrifice of Calvary. Well, how can that be? Well, remember who's offering it. Jesus, a divine person who transcends time and space. Hence, at any time and any place, he can enter into that eternal sacrifice and make it present, anytime, in any place. That's Mass. Hence, with what reverence we should approach Mass. With what reverence we should enter in to the sacrifice of Calvary, offered in an unbloody manner. Every time Mass is offered, any place in the world, anytime. That's the source, the center, and the summit of our faith. The teaching on the real, true, and substantial presence. I've heard things like, well, it's a static presence. Some of the upstart theologians like to make a name for themselves. You know how you make a name for yourself in the church or anywhere else? Say something that's controversial, or write a book that's controversial, you know, or you could make something up, like just fabricate something, you know, pull something out of the furthest recesses of your vivid imagination and call it the Da Vinci Code or something like that, you know. You could do that, you know, make a lot of money, but as my grandmother would say, it's happy horse manure, in plain English. Very, very simple. And so don't be swayed by silliness. Silliness, you know. When you hear that stuff on television and, you know, Jesus got married to Mary Magdalene or something, say, you know, it's like this old Jewish lady. She listened to my catechism series, and she came in the Catholic Church. So she went to RCIA. And they started talking in this vein, you know. So, oh, yeah, well, you know, Blessed Mother had many children. You know, Jesus had brothers and so forth. And maybe Jesus even married Mary Magdalene and so forth. And they came to know, what do you think, Ruth? She said, I think you're all nuts. She said, and actually what she said was, you were there? So you were there? Love your faith. Love this teaching, this reality on the real, true, and substantial presence of Jesus Christ in the Eucharist. The greatest gift a loving God ever gave to his beloved children, the gift of himself. God bless you.